Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Baba Batra. We are up to Perek Aleph Mishna Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbai Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Chana bat Miriam Sason ben Ryan Yoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam began Eden Amen and Leavdi ben Chaim lechaim v'derefua shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa betoch Shah Chole Israel and the Achlama Mera of Binyamin Or Tzion Chai ben Dvorah. As we learned in the previous Mishnah, it was not customary to build tall walls around grain fields for privacy. However, shorter walls were often built around such fields to keep animals away from the crops. These shorter walls were only 10 tefachim high, in contrast to walls that are built to protect privacy, which are 4 amot high. The Mishnah teaches a law regarding such walls. Hamakif et chavero mishalosh uchotav. If one surrounds the grain field of his fellow on 3 of its sides, meaning he buys or owns the fields that are on 3 sides of the grain field, v'gadar et harishona v'et hashniya v'et hashlishit, and he builds walls on the first, second, and third sides, so that the inner field is now surrounded on 3 sides by walls. The walls were built on 3 sides of the boundary between the outer fields and the inner one. The 4th side of the field, however, remains open. And mechayvinoto, we do not require the owner of the inner field to help pay for the walls, because they do not provide him with any benefit, as the animals can still enter the field through the open 4th side. Now, the Mishnah's ruling implies that even according to this first Tana, if the outside field's owner would have built walls on all 4 sides, the inner field's owner would be required to pay. This will be discussed later on. Rabbi Yossi says, Im amad v'gadar et harevi'it, if the owner of the outer field arises and fences in the 4th side, so that the field is now completely enclosed, migalgilin alav et hakol, we place upon the owner of the inner field the entire expense. Once the 4th side is also enclosed, the owner of the inner field will benefit from all of the walls. His animals can no longer enter his field. We therefore require him to pay half the cost of all 4 walls. Now, if the owner of the inner field built the 4th wall, he is certainly required to help pay for the other 3, because he has shown by this act that he is pleased with the fact that the other walls were built. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the Mishnah's first ruling implies that even the first Tana would agree that if the owner of the outer fields built a 4th wall, the owner of the inner field must share in the expense of all the walls. The point of dispute between the first Tana and Rabbi Yossi is that according to the first Tana, the owner of the inner field must pay only half of the cost of an inexpensive field made of reeds, even if the walls that were actually built were made of more expensive stone, because he can claim that a cheaper fence would have been enough to keep the animals out. Rabbi Yossi, however, states that we place upon him the entire expense, meaning that he must pay half of the cost of the walls that were actually built. Rabbi Yossi holds that since the owner of the inner field did not protest when he saw the 4th wall being built, we may assume that he was ready to share the cost of the more expensive walls. And the Rav does tell us, V'alachak Rabbi Yossi, the halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. And that is the end of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Daled returns to the subject of a wall that was built for privacy between 2 partners who agreed to divide their front yard. The Mishnah teaches the laws that apply if such a wall falls down. Kotel chatzer shenafal. If the wall between 2 halves of a courtyard fell down, mechayvin oto livnoto ad 4 amot, we require each neighbor to pay for half of the cost to rebuild it up to a height of 4 amot, which is the height necessary to provide privacy. Meaning, if one of the 2 partners does not wish to share in the cost of rebuilding the wall, the other neighbor can force him to do so. This law is obvious, as we learned already in Mishnah 1, that once the partners agree to divide their yard, they are required to build the wall. It is included by the Tana only to introduce the rulings that follow becheskat shenatan ad shiavi raya shelonatan. And the assumption is that each person has paid his share unless his neighbor brings proof that he has not paid. Since everyone is aware of the law that both neighbors are required to share the cost of rebuilding the wall to a height of 4 amot, we assume that one neighbor would never have rebuilt the wall using his own money. Rather, he would have taken his neighbor to Beit Din had he refused to pay. Therefore, unless the first neighbor has witnesses that he asked the second neighbor for the money and he refused to pay, we assume that the neighbor already paid. When a wall is built between 2 yards, each of the neighbors must pay half of the cost, as we learned in Mishnah 1, but usually one of the neighbors arranges for the work to be done. Here the Mishnah teaches that if one neighbor arranged for the wall to be rebuilt to a height of 4 amot, and when he came to the second neighbor to ask for his share, the neighbor claimed that he had already paid him before the building started, the second neighbor is believed to claim that he has already paid. But we do not require either neighbor to pay for rebuilding it higher than 4 amot, even if the original wall was taller than 4 amot, since the portion of the original wall that was higher than 4 amot is not necessary to provide privacy. One neighbor cannot force the other to share the cost of rebuilding it. Although the original wall was higher than 4 amot, the fact that the neighbor agreed to build it that high the first time does not require him to pay to rebuild it to that height a second time. Samach lo kotel acher. However, if one of the neighbors rebuilt the wall to its original height of more than 4 amot and paid for the extra height with his own funds, and then the second neighbor built another wall near it with the intention of building a roof connecting the 2 walls, the second wall was built parallel to the dividing wall and is the same height as that wall, then even if he has not yet placed the roof upon it to connect the two, we place upon him the obligation to pay his share in the entire first wall, even the portion higher than 4 amot, by building a second wall parallel to and equal in height to the first one. The neighbor clearly shows that it is his intention to eventually use the upper portion of the rebuilt wall as part of a new structure. Therefore, he is required to pay for his share of that portion too. Even if he will not use the rebuilt wall to actually support his roof, but instead will support the roof with poles, he will still derive benefit from the rebuilt wall as one of the side walls of the new structure. Therefore, as soon as he builds the parallel wall, he is required to pay for half of the entire first wall, even the upper part that is not necessary for privacy. Although he has not yet built the connecting roof, once we know that he will use the wall, he is treated as though he has already derived benefit from it, and one who derives benefit from a wall built by his fellow in such a way is required to share in its costs. And in this case, unlike the Mishnah's first case, the assumption is that he has not paid his share for the upper portion of the wall unless he brings proof that he has already paid. The difference between this case and the Mishnah's first case, where the neighbor is believed to say that he already paid for the first 4 amot of the wall, is that in the Mishnah's first case, the obligation to pay for the first 4 amot of the rebuilt wall is known to all, and therefore the neighbor is believed to say that he paid his share in a timely manner. The obligation to pay for the upper part of the rebuilt wall, if one builds a parallel wall, however, is not known to all, because the person might think that once the wall was built anyway, he is allowed to derive benefit from it without paying. Therefore, the assumption is that a person would not pay for that part of the wall unless he was told to do so by Beit Din, and his claim that he did pay voluntarily is not believed unless he has witnesses that he did so. Because of this assumption, we do not believe here the general rule that the burden of proof rests on the person who wishes to take money from his fellow. Therefore, if the one who rebuilt the dividing wall comes to his neighbor who built the parallel wall and asks him to pay his share in the upper portion of the dividing wall, and the neighbor claims that he has already paid, he is not believed unless he brings witnesses who testify that he paid. And that is the Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.